Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. I'm actually live from New York today, so I'm really happy to welcome you for this Wednesday afternoon session of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We have a great session today. You are not going to want to miss this or miss the recording. All of our live online shows are immediately available online at the URL that you registered for this event. So we try to make it easy, and we have panelist resources about from all of our panelists in this session, including myself. So there are some good and rich information available for you to go to and check on later afterwards. Just before I get to our panelists and introduce each of them, I want to mention that we have a very exciting program coming up in future weeks. Next week, December 29th, I know that is 2 days before the end of the year, we will be having a discussion about the year in review with fellow journalists who have been following broadband and paying attention to telecommunications technology issues. Very excited to have those guests with us next week. And the week following, our own TJ York from Broadband Breakfast will be covering the Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, I guess is the way it's called these days, from Las Vegas. So we'll be live from Las Vegas in 2 weeks' time. And then 3 weeks' time, on January 12th, we are starting up again. We have actually done a couple pilots, if you will. We are now regular every second Wednesday of the month. We are at Clyde's of Gallery Place. In addition to being live online, we're going to be in person. So those of you who are in Washington or would like to know more or visit Washington, please join us for that event. That's going to be the tech and telecommunications and media leaders' take on their agenda for 2022. So that's just a taste of what's to come in the next week and the new year. Today, we're going to talk about broadband mapping, and who doesn't want to talk about broadband mapping 3 days before Christmas? So welcome to our panelists. We have an exciting view of, I'm sharing their view, an exciting group of people with us. I have had the pleasure of working with all three of these people over the years, not necessarily in the roles they're currently in, but in different roles. So I can testify that all of them have a lot of good stuff to say to our topic. Now, those of you, again, who have registered for our event, have seen our description, we're going to say, when will the broadband maps get fixed, right? And that's kind of a big question now because of the role of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in November and is now in the implementation phase. So the question of mapping kind of underscores a lot of these questions, and has for many years, right? I mean, those of you who follow us are aware that I have been involved in mapping. I actually originally started Broadband Breakfast as Broadband Census because we were trying to collect in a crowdsourced fashion broadband mapping information. This is probably where I got to know Scott Walston, our first panelist, because Scott has been a data guru and economist for years, and he and I have shared kind of a passion for, let's really try to find out the truth of where broadband mapping is and isn't available. And so Scott's going to start us off, lay the groundwork from his, I guess we could call it, independent vantage point, observing from a nonprofit entity, Technology Policy Institute, the key issues in this. And he will also speak about some very recent work that Technology Policy Institute, TPI, has done in the broadband mapping space. And you can see his bio on the page. He's the president of Technology Policy Institute. I haven't mentioned that. And he's an economist with experience in industrial organization and public policy, and a PhD in economics from Stanford. Scott is going to be followed by Jim Stegeman. He's the president and CEO of CostQuest. And they really are I would have to say, the most significant resource that has been brought to bear thus far in cost analysis of broadband deployment. In fact, CostQuest led the design, coding, and implementation of the broadband analysis model, the BAM, that was used by the FCC in the National Broadband Plan. And then he also led the design, coding, and implementation of the Connect America Cost model, which has 3 acronyms. Don't ask me why: CAM, CACM, and ACAM. And those have all been crucial in the rollout of the reverse auctions that the FCC has been engaged in recent years. Our third guest is Bill Price, and I've known Bill when he was the state broadband development point person in the state of Georgia. I had a role in, I guess we're calling it State Broadband Initiative 1.0, right? We're in at least 2.0, maybe 3.0 right now. And there's definitely a resurgence of interest in state broadband authorities right now. And I'm sure that will be something we talk about together here shortly. But anyway, Bill worked in Georgia and really was quite renowned for the work that Georgia did in developing an address level mapping system. And I think it was through that work in Georgia that he got acquainted with Lightbox, his current employer. And Bill has recently joined them as the Vice President of Government Solutions, responsible for Lightbox broadband data and mapping solutions for government. And Lightbox combines data from real estate platforms, insurance platforms, and decision-making, and I take it telecommunications and broadband. And we'll hear more from Jim when he addresses us. So with those introductory remarks, let's turn it over to you, Scott, for up to 5 minutes to tell us your take on this issue and how we can make sure that the maps get fixed.
Well, thanks, Drew. Thanks for inviting me and having me here. It's always fun talking to you, and always fun talking about data and broadband data. Like you said, we've been talking about it between each other for 15 years. We started with an event when you were Broadband Census, and we've kept working on it. But I think partly that goes to the point that broadband maps can't actually be fixed once and for all. It's always the information is always changing in different ways, and the sorts of things we want to know is also changing, which is one of the reasons why everybody keeps working on it. And along those lines, I think it's important to give some credit to the FCC staff. We hear problems with the FCC maps all the time, which are real. But the FCC has been making lots of progress over the years on making it better and better, and the staff does really a great job in doing that. So. I just think that's important to recognize that the FCC maps, the 477 maps, are much better than they were, a few years ago, and a few years ago they were better than they were a few years before that. So I think with all the problems, it's important to acknowledge that. Now, when building the maps, when deciding what information we want to learn about broadband, the first thing really is to decide exactly what questions we want to answer. And then then gather the data you want to answer those questions. I think the world is littered with databases that people built first and then asked questions later, and realized they didn't quite have the right information to know how to answer it. And the kind of information that we're going to need now to give out all this money might be different in different places. In some places, we want to know, we need to know very, very detailed information about exactly what type of infrastructure is there. And in some cases, we need to know more about the people who live in an area. And those are very different types of problems. So I don't believe that that just sort of this trying to map every structure in the US is really the right way to go. And I'll talk more about that later. It might be the right way in some, for some cases and not in others. But that leads me to my second point, which is that you can learn a lot more from data that's already available than most people realize. And the reason for that is that you can't expect any single data set to have all the answers. We learn by combining data. That's the way it is in every empirical area. You gain insights by combining data in different ways. And that's important. That's important to do. I don't think we're doing enough of that. We seem to expect any single data set to have all of the answers, the 477 data to tell us everything about availability. That's never going to be the case. And that's actually, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at TPI. All of our work on broadband is empirical, and we have spent years and years combining data sets and merging data sets to answer different policy questions. And we realized, first of all, that it was silly that we had to keep going through this empirical exercise every time we wanted to do something. So we built a platform that can take into account any broadband data, and we've put together all of the public data we can find, availability, various types of availability data, adoption data from the census. We've used Ookla's open data, Microsoft's data. We have all of the universal service data, and we have an interface that people can see can do some of the things with. We include analytical tools because mapping is more than just making pretty pictures. You need to learn things from it. So you can see time series, you can do some basic regressions on it. And we are building now, we've put together what we call a connectivity index that combines data from, I believe right now it's 5 different sources to help rank different areas in terms of how connected they are. And then you can pull them apart to see what are the big areas, what are the big problems. So in some cases it might be availability. In other cases, these are adoption issues. And so you want to look more deeply at each of those. And unlike we'll hear from the other panelists, we're not creating new data. We want to take all the data that exists and put it together and make it available for people. So when the FCC, when their new fabric is available, we'll be happy to take it and incorporate it into our platform. Now, the third point, though, for people to understand, I think, is that all data sets have error. They're built with error. That's the way data is. The error can come from all kinds of places. That's why even with political polls, you have a plus and minus. You see a confidence interval. Don't expect any single data set to be perfect. It's another reason why you want to look at multiple data sets altogether. And importantly, you want to understand the error. Don't expect that any data set or even the combination of data sets is going to give you a precise answer. Everything will be measured with error. And then, of course, that error will increase over time because you've got to keep updating the data. And I don't think enough work has been done really on any of the data sets for us to give us sufficient understanding of that error, which will be important when we try to give out information. Now, having made all those comments and criticisms, I'm also really happy that we're paying attention to this now, because when you and I had this event 15 years ago, we had our group of nerds who liked data and were interested in it, but it was a pretty small group, and now people are serious about it, and it gives a lot of fodder for criticism, but that's good. It's a good thing, and I'm excited that people care about it and are working on it, and I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott, for laying that all out. I think again, it makes a strong series of points about the need for multiple data sets and confidence intervals. Let's go ahead and turn now to Jim Stegman. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Drew, and thanks for the introduction. And Scott, thanks for that discussion on multiple data sets. I think it is critical that you do have to look at multiple data sets to really zero in on the issues and understand both the supply and demand side. Most of our work is, I'd say, primarily focused on the supply side, not necessarily the demand side, but the demand side is just as important as the supply side issue. In regards to CostQuest, as Drew mentioned, we are known as cost experts. We developed the FCC's economic model for the National Broadband Plan. That model helped identify kind of the size of the issue. In that plan, we also identified what we believe to be the unserved were at that point in time, because at that point in time, the National Broadband Plan was put together. There were no national maps. There was no 477. The State Broadband Initiative maps weren't available. So we had to go about statistically trying to model where we believe the unserved to be. That model and the National Broadband Plan led to kind of that first solution of trying to figure out how to close the broadband gap. And that's why we created the CAM model or the ACAM model, whatever you might want to call it, but it's the Connect America Cost Model. That model helped the FCC determine how to push money out to help close the broadband gap. That determination was based upon information available, one in part from the 477. It was actually precluded to 477, but the 477 came into play later on. But it funded rural and price cap carriers in the deployment of broadband out to the masses. And that funding system deployed $4 billion annually, still does, to those carriers to get that money out. So that's kind of where we started and where we still focus. Our model was used, our economic model was used to guide the reserve levels for the CAF2 and the RDOF auctions. Those two auctions were, again, new methodology for the FCC to try to close the gap. Those gap closings, though, were based upon the 477 data, and as we'll likely discuss in this discussion, is that 477 has the flaw of a one-served, all-served mentality. That is, if one location in the block is served, which is the basis of geographic information in the 477, then all consumers in that block are assumed to be served, and that leaves a gap of customers who can't get access, one, to funding to get broadband out to them, and two, they can't get service, so it creates an issue. So in that regard, about 2.5 years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago, I lose track of time, a number of the trade associations came to us and said, we really want to try and push the broadband mapping below the census block. We've got some ideas. We'd like you to kind of help us create an approach that shows that going below the census block can actually occur. And it was a proof of concept study that we did on behalf of US Telecom and WISPA. And in that, we showed that you could create this, what is now called the fabric. And on that fabric, providers could report at the address level or in a polygon level to help identify where service was at a location basis, not at a census block basis. So that's really what started, I think, the discussion around the fabric, around the improvement. That proof of concept was delivered and presented to the FCC, but it was also presented to the Congress. I testified in front of Congress, and I believe that helped inform that Broadband Data Act that was published that said, the FCC has to go below the block level, and the FCC needs to adopt a national fabric. And I'll cover kind of what that fabric is. So in regards to this fabric, that fabric is the location of every, what we determine as broadband serviceable point in the country. It's the latitude and longitude of the building, the structure, whatever it may be, to where we believe broadband service needs to be delivered. We've been working on a national data set for the last, actually over 2 years now. We're working on our 5th release right now. That fabric data set has been used by RDOF participants and as they've created their bids. It's being used by hub filers as they have to report where they provide service to. It's being used by engineering firms as they determine how to design broadband networks to provide that coverage that is so sorely needed in rural parts of the country. And it's being used by states. States are using this to help guide their decision process of creating their own broadband plan, their own broadband maps, and their own broadband programs of how to spend the money that's coming down from the feds in the form of CARES money, ARP money, and the new BEAD money that's coming out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. By some estimates, it's $60 to $100 billion that will be coming to these states on how to fund that or how to close the broadband gap. And critical to that is the topic of discussion today, the broadband maps. We need good broadband coverage maps so as to help the states, the FCC, and NTIA really guide the process of directing that money out to those areas that need it. So in that regard, we're working with a number of states right now. We actually have, I think, about 7 states who are using our fabric to internally to either create broadband maps, create broadband programs, or to create and craft their broadband plan. They're using that to work on their CARES funding, their ARP funding, and determining how best to use that money. And a number of them are now looking at that information to help guide the next discussion, which is how do we implement that BEAD program, which is underneath the bipartisan infrastructure plan. So if I can just show a quick map, I think this will help show how we have tried to incorporate not only locational data, but we're bringing in our cost information as well. And what you see here is this is just an illustrative map. We took the 477 data. We actually have data that can go below the census block and identify which locations we believe are served or unserved, but this relies on that. We've identified on the map, you see the little dots on the map, those are actually the unserved locations in the state of Maine. And on those locations, we've appended on what we believe to be the cost to provide fiber out to those locations. If that may be the ultimate solution that a state is looking for, they need to understand what the potential cost is to get to each of those locations. And we put these maps and information together so states can make informed decisions about how to create and craft their programs. And as you can look at this, those purple dots on the map, which are up in the northern part of Maine, the average cost to run a fiber to the home network to those locations exceeds $25,000. And you can start to understand the equation that states have to go through is, if I get a fixed amount of money and I've got a set of unserved locations, how is it that I can spend my money most efficiently on the wide variety of technologies available? We have fixed wireless, we have satellite, and we have fiber, along with the extension of coax systems. How do we spend that money to get everyone served, but to the greatest extent possible? And that's what combining locational information along with cost information allows those states to do. And that's really what our goal is. And we're happy to announce that in the near future, we will be announcing a major partnership with a global consulting firm, with John Wilkins and Paul Dessaw of Quadra, and with a number of noted experts in the broadband field to create a solution for states to use as they develop the programs and efforts they need to develop to actually intelligently and efficiently spend the money that will be coming down, and to close those gaps. And again, coming back to where we're going to talk about today, it's all dependent upon the national broadband map. What locations are served, what locations are not served. And with that, Drew, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's go now to our third and final panelist, Bill Price. Go ahead, Bill, and tell us a little bit about your experience and what you'd like to share with us.
Sure. Thank you, Drew, and happy holidays to everybody. And thanks for having me here today. This has been of interest to me since 2009 when I started this journey with you, Drew. And it has been a journey, and I'm still on it. And now I'm with Lightbox, having joined the Lightbox team this year, coming from the state of Georgia, where I was responsible for broadband programs and mapping and grant development for the state. So who is Lightbox? Well, Lightbox, is a nationwide location data services company. They've been focused since the beginning on refining and enhancing location data, for precision and accuracy and veracity, meaning updates, frequent updates, since their start, right? The location data and services are being used to inform decisions in the financial sector, real estate, insurance, and government. Lots of government, federal and state agencies use the location data in their workflow, right? The data and the technology powers online applications for companies such as Apple, Google, and Zillow. So a lot of people don't know about Lightbox because we're typically behind the scenes. And our location data is being used in some states today to develop broadband mapping. And we'll be announcing more states as they happen. So what happened was in Georgia, while I was there, we we started out thinking we were going to build our own location database, and we quickly found out how long and how difficult that was going to be. So we went and evaluated commercially available location data. And, we found Lightbox to be the best one that we found. So we went with that to develop, our broadband mapping. What you're looking at, hopefully, Drew, you can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like in Georgia, we wound up with 5.2 million location information in the database of locations, residential and business. And we worked with 44 broadband service providers to see where they could serve if they got an order in 10 business days. Well, that resulted in a mass of green dots. And what we were left over with was 507,000 unserved structures in the state of Georgia. So then now we know not only how many problems we have, but where they are and how they're clustered. Are they close to roads? Or are they not close to roads? And so the state of Georgia today, Governor Kemp has 300 million in play right now for applications against these red dots, basically, right? And so the applicants get the location data, they have the street address, they have the parcel information, they have the lat long coordinates, whether the structure is a single structure or multi-structure, single unit, multi-unit. So, if you're really going to put in a grant application or you're going to invest in broadband, you need the best, most accurate data you can get. When you compare it to, this is what the original or the current FCC data says in terms of served and unserved in the state of Georgia. The orange census blocks are one served, all served, and the yellow are 100% unserved. Well, after our mapping effort, that's what Georgia looks like, the yellow being the unserved. So it's very, very powerful when you have good data. And now that providers are very motivated to work with states to get this more accurate mapping at the state level and otherwise, we can all do a better job. We can make a big difference in closing the broadband gap. And, the cost of doing this is so low, less than 5% of the total funds that states already have from their first ARP distribution. And it can be done in a matter of months. It really, to me, it seems there's no reason why any state shouldn't, undertake it to evaluate their own investments and, the money they already have and then the future money. And with really good location data, it can be applied in other investments, water, sewer, roads, whatever. So I think there's a great opportunity, Drew, for everyone to do better investing government money. So that's all I have.
Well, thank you very much for being with us and sharing. And it's great to kind of learn more about the role that Lightbox is playing in this space, right? So now, obviously, I circulated some questions ahead of time, and I'll kind of turn to those, but I want to just kind of try to follow what's happening, right? And Jim, I don't know if this has just occurred to me or I wonder what the thoughts that each of you would have is if we made this simple, or if the FCC made the simple change of flipping the presumption, and instead of calling every block served when there is one person in that block that is served, what if we just called every block in which one person is unserved? Like, what would that one small, simple presumption change do to this debate dynamic, whether in terms of cost modeling with these reverse auctions or otherwise? Love your thoughts on that, Jim and Bill and Scott. Make sure you're not muted, Jim. Okay.
Yeah, I can jump in first. I mean, in part, you've got issues on both sides. If you went the approach you're talking about, which is if there's one unserved, the block is unserved, then you may overfund the area. And we've got the same issue we've got now. If you're using some of the mapping efforts to guide funding, you want actually a good representation. I know on mobility maps for 477, it's shapefile driven, so it's actually a percentage. It'd be great if at least from the get-go we could get a percentage of the number served, so at least it provides the intelligence to understand how many locations are underserved and what is the size of the issue. When we worked with the state of New York, when the state of New York had a $500 million broadband auction back in 2018, the approach that they used is if you reported a block is served, you had to serve the whole block. And if you couldn't serve the whole block, you couldn't report that block. And basically was putting the onus upon the providers who are reporting service to take ownership of that block by saying, if I report that block, if a customer calls, I will serve them. That way it removes the kind of the variability from the equation. But that's just how one state approached it. But I think we really need to get that granularity underneath the block.
Bill and Scott, thoughts on that?
You want me to have a go at it?
Sure. I mean,
go ahead, Scott. No, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, partly that assumes the information that we don't have. So, just because you don't have the information that somebody is connected doesn't necessarily mean that they're not. And I don't think we have the information to do that either. And again, it depends what question you want to answer. For sort of basic policy questions like, is connectivity increasing over time? The way the FCC does it is fine. For asking where exactly do we need to add more, where exactly is a problem that it doesn't work. And so now that we're talking about investing in specific areas, that's where we have this problem. So it really depends what questions we're asking. It's been fine for sort of tracking the trends in connectivity. It's not as good for deciding where to invest. But I think another important point to make is is again thinking about what we're going to use the data for. A lot of sophisticated information goes into the products that Jim and Bill are talking about, but cost models and any and all of this, like I said, there's measured with error. Every input into them has error, and we don't want to create a situation where we're trying to tell governments that they can use some master data set to decide where to invest. That's just not the case, and it never will be the case. We can use that information for them to help, ideally create biddable areas, areas that don't have service, but then you ask firms to bid for it because they will know their costs of providing service. And you ask them, and if everything goes well, you give the subsidy to the company that asks for the smallest amount of money that meets some, whatever criteria. The FCC has used weighted measures. And so, that's I think it's important to remember that these models are not so that the government can, decide that money goes here, here, and here, but to help, guide a process that allow, like a reverse auction, like competitive bidding, that will give us the biggest bang for the buck. So don't, data will always have problems. It can get better and better, and the models are very sophisticated, but they will never be the answer. We just can't know that with enough detail.
It should not be the framework for Chairman Xi's national broadband plan, right?
Exactly, right.
Bill.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I thought about this one a little bit, Drew. So it reminded me that my first private sector boss, I won't embarrass the sector, let's just say it was in the communications industry, told me that, he said, Bill, inefficiency in government is good. And, all vendors know that, right? Because it's waste and they spend more than they need to, and it feeds a lot of people. So that's kind of where we really are, right? We've been using inefficient means to determine how much and where, right? And everybody knows it's inaccurate, and it results in an overstatement of where broadband is, and it leaves a lot of the rural people out in the cold, which they've been, in Georgia, at least for over a decade, letting their elected officials know about it. And they passed legislation, and we did that broadband map and set up a grant program because of it. So, the citizens, have a role in this as well as all the rest of us, right, in getting the right attention. And the good news is we do appear to have the right attention, right, in rural America. So I think the question is, for government, especially states and federal, are we going to approach broadband investment as an investment with accurate data, or are we going to continue to guess and just, dole out funds? So we're clearly saying to each other, there's no reason to continue doing that. So let's get on with it.
So we've got a question from Joan Engebretson of Telecompetitor. When do you expect the FCC to have an updated, more granular broadband availability map based on the new Form 477 information? And when will the FCC have the location fabric available? Let's let everyone take that question. I may supplement some historical stuff after that if we want to go deeper, but start with you, Jim. You're on mute again, Jim.
Yeah, got that problem. So when we talk about the updated map comes from the broadband data collection. That broadband data collection is tied to the fabric. Providers will be required to report at which fabric locations they serve or the polygon that provides that service. So in part, that broadband data collection from the carriers can't start until the fabric is procured by the FCC. The FCC did initially award out that fabric to CostQuest. It is currently under protest. The expectation is sometime in 2022 that protest will be resolved. I can't give you a date. I really don't know. This is just my earliest guess. It's based upon just working through the math that providers need to be given 6 months notice to provide that broadband data collection data. They need to get access to the fabric, so they're all kind of interlinked. There's a challenge process. So my best guess is end of 2022 is the earliest that we'll have updated maps. Most likely it'll bleed into 2023 as far as what's available to the public for consumption. But that, again, is just my guess based upon a lot of unknowns.
Bill, your reaction to the question that Joan has asked.
Sure. So, broadband mapping is a process, right? And the FCC in their fabric procurement stated they wanted the fabric within 3 months of award, right? So that's the first piece of the, baking the cake, the broadband map cake, right? Now in America, we've got, over 1,000 ISPs, right? And they range from grandmother with 500 customers to ginormous companies. And their capability to respond and give the new map effort, what the feds are asking or the FCC is asking for, is going to take some time. And I guess the FCC can establish deadlines to get all the data in, but the final completeness and accuracy and true representation of availability, the served areas and locations, depends on the percentage of ISPs participating, right? So that is going to take some time. And, I agree with Jim, best case, latter part of 2022, worst case after that. So that's really, I think that's where we are, Drew.
So Bill, Lightbox is seeking to be a player in this field. And just again, our readers, I'm sure, will have heard this or seen this, but Lightbox is the entity that has registered that protest. Now, you may not be able to speak to that. I understand that, Bill, but could you just speak to this question that a lot of people are asking, which is, do we really need to wait until the end of 2022, the start of 2023, to have the mapping resources available to implement the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act? Is that what this mean? Is that what this means, that we're going to be waiting for this long?
Look, Drew, they already have a bunch of money, right? I mean, like, our governor has half of $4.5 billion out of ARP. We're not even down to the infrastructure money next year, right? And he's launching grant programs, right? And so whether you're doing it for your current money and your current investment to solve this problem in your state, or whether you're thinking, because we had conversations when I was at Georgia with other states about, well, we need to do our own maps to protect ourselves against the potential inaccuracies of the federal effort, because nobody knows how well they're going to do, given that historically they haven't done so good. In accurate mapping. It was like, we need to be able to, we should go ahead, because we can use the money we have to produce our own data and our own maps. We can use it now for our current money, and we can use it to advocate or defend ourselves against, the results of the federal effort if we don't agree with it. Right? You see what I'm saying?
So you're saying, if I understand what you're saying is that states shouldn't wait for this national map. They should go ahead and do their own. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they don't have to. Number one, they don't have to, right? And
I'm not saying they're required, but they can. They can.
Well, yeah, they can. And what I was trying to lay out was the discussion we had amongst ourselves across multiple states. It's like, well, why should we do this, right? And well, we got all this money, so if we want to invest it wisely, we need something now, and it can happen relatively fast, so it doesn't hold you up. It doesn't impact your requirement to obligate the ARP money by the end of 2024 or spend it all by the end of 2026. So do you want to guess, or do you want to have accurate information? That's one reason. That's one pillar. The other pillar is that when the federal government does come out, whether it's USDA Reconnect or whether it's the FCC programs, do you want to be in a position with what you believe to be accurate data that if theirs disagrees with yours, you can advocate for yourself, defend yourself? It's like in the infrastructure thing, the process there, they're going to use the FCC's map and results to do the initial allocation by state above $100 million, right? But the process allows for a state to advocate and challenge the federal map results, Drew. So, I mean, if you don't care, then don't do it, right? But if you do, then I mean, the cost and time to get there is pretty short and pretty cheap, you know. So it seems like a pretty no-brainer investment.
Okay, Scott, I want to ask Scott, but I want to just tee it up a little bit more. So 10 years, 12 years ago, when this process with the American Investment and Recovery Act of 2009 passed, and obviously there was a state broadband component, and I was involved in that. I led a state broadband mapping effort where we collected this data from providers, and that fed into National Broadband Map 1.0, published in 2011, right? 10 years ago, almost 11 years ago now. And that map, you know, obviously was only as good as the data that it had, only as good as the assumptions behind census blocks, and only as good as it's kept current, right? And around 2015, 16, the FCC stopped because there was this program did not continue. The FCC basically stopped updating that national broadband map, went back to the old style Form 477 with a lot of those questions, problems. And we are where we are because of the broadband maps getting stale. Now, at the same time, there's so many more resources now than there was 10, 12 years ago, right? There's so many more data platforms. Jim and Bill, you both spoke about how you're kind of doing this yourself anyway, right? I mean, you're building your own data sets, right? There are resources. Scott has just talked about this kind of tool you've got. There's at least dozens more that we could rattle off. There's so much data out there now in terms of broadband availability. And yes, there's never one source of truth ultimately. But my question for you, Scott, is like, why do we need a federal broadband map, or do we? What is your take on what now is needed to make wise decisions on broadband deployment?
Well, I think we need data, not necessarily maps. I think it's a mistake to keep calling them maps, even though we all do, and I will too. We need different things at different places. And first, I think people need to set expectations on, you know, what this federal map will be. We start with this idea that the blocks are too big. But remember, there are 11 million of them. It's already a big process to put information together at the block level. But we also know that it is true that that's not small enough. I think somebody in the chat noted that in Alaska, census block is enormous. It may not be as big as Texas, but it's maybe as big as New Jersey. I don't know. So that's not sufficient there. On the other hand, it's not the case that we need more detailed information on availability in every block. We just don't. Jim said that demand is important. That's a really important point. We should be paying more attention to that too. So in some areas, we may be wanting more information on supply conditions. So this mapping, what people tend to think of as mapping. But in other places, we need to understand why people are not subscribing to the choices that they have, even when, if you take into account Lifeline and now the EBB, the cost of them may be pretty close to zero. Mm-hmm. And that requires a different kind of information that might be more survey based. In particular, we think about the way we collect information on broadband compared to the way we collect information on other aspects of the economy. We still have this idea in broadband that you have to do something like a census. In fact, you started with broadband census and you moved away from that. But we don't do that with other parts of the economy. We recognize that survey methods can be much more sophisticated and focus on the specific topics and areas that we need. And we just don't do that here. for whatever reason, and maybe it's just historical, because in 1896 we did a census of telephones and we never could stop counting. So that's one thing. I don't think it's a cliche, but it's not a one size fits all. We don't need that map everywhere. In some places we really do. But we should think carefully about where we do and where we don't. Second is, people to set their expectations. Like I said, there will be error in the new fabric, no matter how careful anybody is who does it. It's just, that's the nature of data. And even if it's exactly right when it's collected, it'll be wrong the next day, because this is something you have to keep updating. And you can guarantee that whenever this fabric is released, 2 days later, people are going to start saying, "Oh, you said I'm connected, but I'm not connected." That's going to happen then too. So there's not one right answer. We can get better data, but I think we should be targeting the type of information we need to the different problems in different places. Did we lose Drew? I think we might have lost Drew.
Yeah, Scott, I'll kind of respond to what you said. I fully agree with you. I think the current focus on broadband maps, I think in part is historical. It's just the way universal service systems were set up. It's the way the CAF funding was set up. It was always focused on supply side issues, and it was focused on locational data or granular data. There hasn't been as great a focus, as you said, on the demand side, and I think that's where part of the big issue is as we think about urban America, these maps are not targeted to urban America, where there is a broadband gap. That broadband gap is not necessarily supply. It's the fact that people can't afford it, don't know how to use it, don't have the equipment, all that, and that is outside of what Bill and I are focused on, which is more the supply side. Where are the locations that supply needs to go to?
Well, as you've seen, my broadband failed me, but I got onto another network and I'm back, and I'll listen for the answers that were said while I was gone. But I want to come to a question that Carol Maddie asked, which I think is a very good one here. It may be kind of critical of the state notion here, which is that accepting the premise that service provider availability data may be inaccurate, why should anyone assume that data they provide to the states will be more accurate than the data they submit to the FCC? In both cases, it's still the service provider data that's being laid on top of an inventory of serviceable locations. Reactions to that question?
I don't think it's so much of the accuracy, because they submit data to the FCC that the FCC doesn't make public, and there's negotiations between the ISPs and the FCC and what's public and what's not. So maybe they make different agreements with the states. I don't know, but that's partly why the map that the NTIA has put together is actually not public, even though one would expect a map from the NTIA to be public, because they have data, they have proprietary information. So that's part of the question of what the public gets to see. I think it's less accuracy and more transparency.
So from my perspective on that question, Drew, accuracy, Scott made the point, there will be inaccuracies, there will be errors, humans make mistakes, data changes, you do the best you can, and you get to a much higher level of confidence about accuracy than where we've been in the past, right? We can stop guessing, but there will be mistakes and there will be errors, and we have to correct for them, and there are processes to do that. And Scott's also right that it's really the data. The maps are just visual representations of what the data is to make it simpler for, leaders, right, who don't want to plumb the data. Tell me what it means, right? And maps are just ways to tell them what it means, right? So both are important, but he's right. At the end of the day, if you're an ISP and you're looking at putting in 50% of the money that it takes to build to 500 homes that are unserved, you need accurate location data, right? You don't design roads, you don't deploy electricity, you don't build water systems when you don't know where the locations are that you're building the darn thing to. So location data really matters. And if a state or the federal government doesn't have confidence in what the providers are telling them, because God forbid providers wouldn't game the system, right, to get more money out of it, There's ways to increase our confidence in the accuracy. I mean, you can refer to speed test data, and where there's enough speed test volume, which is typically in cities and urban markets, it's a great, data set tool to validate what providers are telling you in their submissions. We can also, like state of New York, they're paying a consulting firm who has teams of guys, and they go out and drive the county roads, and they're looking to validate infrastructures there. So it's not like we have to accept what we're being given at face value and do nothing about it.
So in the resources guide for this event, each of you have provided some background. I've also provided a background, which was a story I wrote for Broadband Communities a little over 2 years ago. And I laid out, look, there's different lenses from which this broadband mapping issue can be viewed. It can be viewed from the perspective of marketing and publicity for providers, or from the perspective of subsidizing rural deployments. It can be used by regulators who want to kind of keep providers' feet to the fire on their promises of speeds and so forth. But it can also be used as a tool for aiding in new construction of broadband. And from that perspective, fiber maps are extremely useful. I guess where all this is going, and I'd like to get each of your feedback on this, is what is the role of this map from a public perspective, from a perspective of innovation without permission. Okay, that's a key kind of mantra of our age, in which having data can allow people to build off of and do very cool and important things. And yet we've taken a step backwards, and we're talking now about data being proprietary, where before there was a national and open broadband map. So I'm sure there are reasons on both sides. I'm not trying to prejudge this, but I definitely want to hear from Scott, from Jim, you too, on this. So you obviously have a lot to say on this, and from Bill on what should be open and what does not need to be open about a broadband data collection and/or broadband map.
Well, I think it always depends on what is the question that you want to answer. You want it. The most important thing, if you're talking about building new infrastructure, I think, is to make it possible to create areas where you can have competitive bidding to supply that infrastructure, and then require reporting that can be checked to see whether the suppliers are actually following through on their promises. And that has to do with not just the information at the beginning. So you're going to need information at the beginning to set the biddable areas. You're going to need to have a good challenge process, which allows somebody to say that they already provide service in the area, so you don't have overbuilding. But on the other hand, you need to make sure that that's actually accurate, that there really is service there, so that you have to check that. You want to then have careful auction design, so that the risk is taken mostly by the company that bids, not necessarily by the government, and so on. So at each stage, you want different kinds of information, and it's got to answer the specific questions that you're talking about. Like I said, in some places we want really detailed survey data of the type that the Bureau of Economic Analysis or Bureau of Labor Statistics could do if they had the resources to do it. Everybody wants them to do more. And in other places, we need detailed availability data, so that we can create biddable areas that can then be contested or not, to have firms bid. So it really depends on the questions that you want to answer. It's not going to be the same thing everywhere. Jim. That was a good way of not answering your question, I'm sorry to say.
Well, let's hear Jim's answer or non-answer, as the case may be.
Yeah, in regards to the question to openness and availability of data, I think it's key to have the data accessible so that the consumer has some word in this process. Right now, 477 challenge process, consumers can't challenge it. I think the capability of making this data available, making coverage information accessible at, if I want to go in and say, who gives me service? I can, in the future, in these broadband maps, go, this is who claims to provide me service. I don't have that capability today. I know from my neighbors or from discussions who might be able to provide me service, but now I have a source that says, these are who say, and if I call and they can't, I now have a process through the FCC's challenge process as a consumer to say, I can't get service. So from the granular point of view, this provides the consumer more power, provides neighborhoods, communities more power to get coverage gaps identified so that some solution can be developed, whether it's funding, whether it's an extension of cable systems, whatever it may be. We don't know what the issue is until we can identify that issue. And that's really what the granularity and availability of the data means. As far as open has many definitions. As far as making the coverage information open, some of that's the providers have restrictions. From the fabric side, some of the fabric vendors have restrictions on the use of the data and how that data can be distributed. But that I don't think is as important as accessibility to the information so that consumers can make those informed decisions and inform the process.
Bill,
Yeah, Drew,
reaction.
Proprietary doesn't mean it can't be shared. Proprietary just means, we spent a lot of money and we developed it like we did in Lightbox, and we have this national broadband fabric that's commercially available now. And in Georgia and other places, I was on the Georgia side. I negotiated the rights to share the data with providers who are participating in mapping, to share the data with cities and counties and state agencies, to share the data with grant applicants who need to put in a grant applicant, because the state wants the grant applicants to use the location data that they say is true, right? So proprietary doesn't mean you can't be shared. And in the FCC RFP, the biggest factor in that RFP was data sharing rights. They were hammering on it big time, right? So I think we're going to get to a place where the data that people need is going to be available.
All right. Well, our time has flown, as is always the case when you're talking about broadband mapping. I am going to ask 3 closeout questions for each of our panelists to get them a response on. Let's do like we just did in the order that we spoke. The first is just definitionally, what is the fabric? Is that a proprietary term that anyone kind of holds or doesn't hold? What does a fabric mean as opposed to the data? That's question 1. Question 2 is, what's the MVP? What's the minimum viable product, or MVM, minimal viable map that a state needs or the federal government needs to get money out the door of the IIJA? And question 3 is, how important is it that we measure things like speeds and prices in addition to availability and use, right? Speeds and prices and use. Okay, so repeating one more time, the 3 closeout questions are, what does the fabric mean? Okay, just so we have some clarity on at least one question. Number 2 is, what's the minimum viable map? And question 3 is speeds, pricing, and use of broadband. Scott, you give us your closing thoughts.
I have no idea what a fabric is. I'll just leave it there.
On that one.
So the minimum viable product, I think it's something that helps us answer the relevant questions in the relevant areas. And so it's not the same thing everywhere. And we should be thinking more carefully about that, because I don't think we have. Collecting more information on prices is really hard. Anybody who's done work on prices knows how difficult it was. I wrote a paper using the prices, a data set of like 15,000 different prices around the world. And I had this really complicated equation for figuring out what an actual price was, taking into account all the different factors. And then, of course, we only know advertised prices, not what people are actually getting. So really, if we want to know more about it, and I think we should be engaging BLS, because they are the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are the ones who understand prices. And they already have one internet price index. But with more resources and more attention, they could probably create ones that are more detailed. But if we're serious about getting prices and not just, and this is, I'm not talking about a comparison tool for consumers. I'm talking about something to help policymakers, then we should be engaging the BLS, because those are the people who know how to study prices.
Thank you, Scott. Jim.
Yeah, so I do know what the fabric is. So I can kind of fill in that part. The fabric, we actually coined the term back when we did the proof of concept. We just called it the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, just trying to come up with a name. Fabric is a common geospatial term describing just data across a geographic plane. So we came up with that term. But the fabric just represents those points of location that either have broadband or would require broadband. So it's looking for people where people live, play, work, and trying to make sure that we understand where those locations are so that we can then understand the size of the issue. And that term is freely available. The FCC adopted that term, and that's what they're looking for in what they.
It's not a cost quest product, just to be clear, right? It
is not
a term that you've used and embraced, right?
Yeah, Bill will more than happily say they have a fabric data set as we do. It's an estimation of where those broadband points are, and then it's the information that flows along with those points. We attribute more information to our fabric points, such as cost, demographics, and whatnot. As far as minimal viable unit or information a state needs and to guide these programs, I think it's imperative for states to start the process, if they haven't already, to really understand. Because in part, while they're guaranteed a minimum of 100 million, the rest of the money is dependent upon what that broadband map says. They should be interested in getting in their voice into that discussion, challenging maps. I think Carol Maddie had a great question. I think the states provide potentially the ability to go down to the local level to collect additional information to help on identifying really where the gaps are and to provide that challenge process. So I think it's really imperative upon states to actually start now to understand that. What's the minimum? It really, based upon the fact that the BEAD program is dependent upon the locational data, it really sets the bar of where you need to be as far as understanding coverage. As far as the rest of the data, the pricing, availability, all that, I think is critical to the solution. The solution is not only, as I said, not only the supply side, it's the demand side. We need to understand that demand side. I know the FCC collects pricing information because of the affordability comparison that needs to be made. That may need to be expanded so that we get greater information. Also tied to this, there should be a minimum offering that is an affordable offering. Some carriers may deploy gigabit service and that's all they offer, but the price of that is exorbitant and people can't afford it. Can there be a national offering that what is considered broadband access that is affordable? And I'll end it there.
Well, thank you again. And Bill, go ahead, and then I'll have a few words as we wrap up.
Sure. If you look at, what we say it is, it's over 160 million records about every structure, residential or commercial, that might want to order broadband service in the United States. And it's information about those structures. It's where it actually is on a point on the earth. How far is it away from the street? Is it a residential or commercial structure? Is it a single unit or is it multi-unit? All that kind of information you'd want to know if you're going to invest your money to build out broadband service, whether it's the state's money or the applicant's money, everything you'd want to know and need to know to design and cost out how much money you're asking for. So, it's a lot of records, right? To me, Drew, I think of it as a spreadsheet, right? Where every row is like your house, my house, the tractor barn. And it excludes things that are not where you would anticipate broadband service being ordered to, like the pump house, right? But could be the tractor barn where all the tractors are, right? But that's part of the whole process, and the feds, the FCC, the whole notion of identifying these kind of structures is really important to them and it's important to the state. So I think I've addressed that, Drew. I'm not sure I did, but try.
Well, I appreciate that very much for each of you. We are just a bit over our time. So before we thank our guests, I just want to remind you that we have on the page the URL that I've shared, the panelist resources. I'm going to ask Bill and Jim if they'd be willing to email me those slides, and we'll post those 2 slides that they shared as well. We know you've asked a lot of questions. We haven't been able to get all of them. If you'd like to forward them to our guests, feel free to email them and we'll do so. I've mentioned our upcoming events at the top of the hour, but next week, Wednesday, we'll be back with Year in Review, New Year's Party with Sean Buckley of Broadband Communities, Sarah Lai Sterland of Broadband Breakfast, Phil Harvey, editor-in-chief of Light Reading, and Bernie Arison of Telecompetitor. On behalf of our three wonderful guests, Scott Walston, Jim Stegman, and Bill Price, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. See you next Wednesday for the last Broadband Breakfast Live Online of 2021.